No New Testament document has been more misunderstood and more misused than the book of Revelation, otherwise known as the Apocalypse, from its Greek name, apokalypsis. That is partly because the document is composed in a literary genre relatively unknown today, but widely known in first century Jewish Christian circles, namely apocalyptic. Apocalyptic uses cryptic language, strange symbols, bizarre imagery, and exaggerated figures to make a point with its readers and hearers. My late teacher, George Beasley Murray, aptly described apocalyptic as similar to today's political cartoons. Political cartoonists draw exaggerated and sometimes highly symbolic images of current political or popular figures, knowing that their readers, familiar with the context of the political debate, will get it. However, look at those same political cartoons a century later, and the reader will be mystified, being completely unaware of the historical context that gives them meaning. The same thing is true of the apocalypse. The first readers got it. But if we are to get it today, we must negotiate distances that divide us from them. Add to that the fact that the book of Revelation is not just about them then, it is also about us now, and the interpretive issues intensify. Revelation is about the future. That is self-evident to anyone who reads the book. But whether it is a blueprint for the future is another matter. Moreover, a cautionary tale to those who would use the book of Revelation to predict the second coming of Christ is the fact that they thereby claim to know more than Jesus himself knew, who said, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father." And so emphasize the historical to the exclusion of the prophetic, and you make the book of Revelation an interesting but wholly useless period piece. Emphasize the prophetic to the exclusion of the historical, and you turn the book of Revelation into a callous and cruel crystal ball, as though the author, writing to people in his own time experiencing horrible suffering and persecution and even martyrdom, looks at them and says, "Hey guys, just hang in there. I know it's tough right now, but 2,000 years from now, it's all going to work out. Isn't that great?" The strategy for a proper interpretation of the book of Revelation is to maintain the balance between then and now, between them and us, to recognize that it was both written to Christians in the first century and Christians in the 21st century. And what is the message of the book? Just this: in the end, God wins. If the purpose of Revelation is not merely to satisfy our curiosity about the future, then what is the purpose of the book? In a single word, hope. John writes to encourage a dispirited and disheartened church then and now that things are not what they seem, that what good can do to evil is always in the end greater than what evil can do to good, that Satan cannot prevail, and in fact is already defeated, because in the end, God wins. Using the classic Johannine dualism so characteristic of the fourth gospel, the book of Revelation presents a picture of the struggle between God and Satan from two vantage points: the apparent and the real, the temporal and the eternal, the now and the then. While it may appear that evil is winning, John tells us to look again, look more carefully. And when we do, we see that even God's most glaring, apparent defeat, the cross, ultimately turns out to be Satan's moment of vanquishment. From one point of view, the cross was evil's greatest triumph, the Son of God done in on a Roman gibbet. But from another point of view, the cross turned out to be evil's undoing, the very instrument through which God saves the world. Indeed, in the book of Revelation, God doesn't just defeat evil, he transforms it into an instrument of good, presses it into the service of salvation. It is perhaps the most profound theology in the New Testament, comparable to Joseph's statement to his traitorous brothers who had sold him into slavery when he says, "Do not be distressed because you sold me here. It was not you who sent me here, but God." Perhaps the most powerful example of this message comes through in the vision of the Lamb in chapter 5. John, writing to a ravaged and persecuted church, receives a vision of God's ultimate triumph over Satan and evil, which is the central message of the book. But when John is told to look and describe what he sees, he describes a bloody, beaten, bludgeoned, dying lamb. And John's response is predictable. "Oh, great. Thanks loads. That's just how I feel." But then the voice from the throne tells him to look again and then describe what he sees. And when he looks again, he sees a bloody, beaten, bludgeoned, dying lamb seated on a throne. And the heavenly chorus breaks into song, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain." While John was clearly writing to give comfort and hope to the church of his day, his vision of the inexorable and irrepressible triumph of God speaks to every generation of Christians on this side of Christ's return. The fact that Revelation was written in a literary genre unknown to most modern readers makes the book difficult to interpret. That said, there have been four interpretive approaches to the book of Revelation, chiefly. First is preterist. This view sees Revelation as addressed exclusively to the first century readers with no prophetic meaning for today whatsoever. Like other apocalypses of the period, this view sees Revelation as offering hope to a suffering and persecuted people, as well as imminent judgment on their persecutors. Obviously, this approach takes the historical context of the original writers and readers seriously, which is its strength. But it fails to see in Revelation much of a word from God for the church today. The second approach is called historicist. This view sees the sequence of events in the apocalypse as something of a history of the church from its beginning to the present day. The sections of the book correspond to epochs or dispensations of world history, or more precisely, church history. The third view is called futurist. The most popular approach to Revelation is the futurist approach, in part because Revelation presents itself as a prophecy, see chapter 1, verse 3, and a revelation of what must take place soon, chapter 1, verse 1. As with the other interpretive approaches, futurists nuance their approach depending on who they are. Some, for example, acknowledge that the letters to the seven churches in chapters 2 and 3 were addressed to Christians in the first century. But they would assert that chapters 4 through 22 constitute prophecies related to the return of Christ, the final judgment, the end of history, and the advent of the kingdom of God. The fourth approach is called the idealist approach. This approach denies any historical references in the book altogether and instead sees Revelation as purely symbolic, a grand parable of the ongoing struggle of good and evil. But which is correct? Well, given the character of the book of Revelation as both apocalyptic literature and prophecy, it is probably best not to lock in on any one of these interpretive methods, but rather to see the strengths and weaknesses in each, and therefore to employ a mix of methods which are not in and of themselves mutually exclusive. For example, many who approach the book from an idealist's point of view also see much in the book as having historical significance, both for first century and 21st century audiences. Consequently, one need not lock oneself into a single interpretive camp. In most cases, the particular passage itself will suggest an interpretive method to follow. Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 6 has been perhaps the most interpreted passage in the entire book. It is, of course, the passage that relates to the millennial reign of Christ. Chiefly, the issue at stake is this: is the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth mentioned in these verses intended to be taken literally or figuratively? The answers have been three, chiefly, though even within those answers there are nuances and variances of interpretation. Let's look at each. First, the premillennial point of view. This is the view that the return of Christ will occur before the millennium begins. Even if interpreters agree on this, there are still subtle nuances that divide the premillennial camp. For example, dispensational premillennialists believe the return of Christ will occur in two stages. First, the rapture, in which Christ returns to rapture his church out of the world, and then second, the final return of Christ following the tribulation but preceding the millennium. However, historical premillennialists, which would include many evangelical British scholars, believe that the return of Christ will be a one-stage event, occurring at the close of the tribulation, but prior to the millennium. The second view is called postmillennialism. These interpreters believe the return of Christ will take place following the millennium rather than before. The millennium in this view is not so much the work of the returning Christ as it is the transforming work of the church, sort of the view that here on earth God's work must truly be our own. Postmillennialism is often associated with progressive and evolutionary visions of a better society brought on by human effort. Of course, 2 world wars and the atomic bomb have tended to discredit this view among modern interpreters. The third view is called amillennialism. This is the view that the 1,000-year reign of Christ is not to be taken literally at all, but rather a symbol, a metaphor for the triumph of the rule and reign of God. So to summarize, while to be sure the position one takes on this issue will affect one's overall interpretation of the book of Revelation, it is nonetheless important to remember that the book of Revelation is more than just the millennium, and that reducing the entire book to just 6 verses runs the risk of missing John's larger purpose in writing.